You're watching Thames Television. The time is 10 o'clock.
Britain's trade gap doubles as the recession hits exports. Stephanie kidnapped man in court charged with Julie Dart murder. Police shoot dead a gunman after a car chase in Suffolk. Britain to help Russia get rid of its nuclear weapons. And Australia's PM says Britain didn't give a forex for us. Good evening. Britain's trade balance last month was the worst for a year, nearly £800 million in the red. The government had been hoping that exports would help lift the economy. In fact, they were at their lowest level for almost a year. The current account deficit for January was £794 million, nearly double both the predictions and the December figure of £409 million. Exports, especially to Europe, fell back sharply, down 7.5%. The Economic Secretary to the Treasury, Mr. John Maples, called the figures erratic. Labour's Mr. Gordon Brown said they were a withering indictment of government policy. The Liberal Democrats leader, Mr. Ashdown, said they underlined the government's disgraceful paralysis.
Monthly trade figures can be erratic, but these are of no comfort to the government, which is desperate for some sign of an upturn in the economy. Instead, the highest balance of payments deficit for a year and the sharpest monthly increase for a year provided ample ammunition for the opposition.
When during the course of a recession you have your current account deficit widening, your visible trade deficit widening very substantially, and at the same time you have output, investment and employment falling, then you need urgent action to remedy the problems of the domestic economy.
This underlines the gloom that now hangs over the economy and underlines the government's disgraceful paralysis in the face of a recession which is now clearly staying where it is, if not getting deeper.
Ministers said over the year exports were still up and conditions were ripe for recovery.
Interest rates have come down, inflation has come down. I think that people's confidence has improved. The foundations for the recovery from this recession are in place. The exact moment at which it will happen is something that's impossible to predict. It's all to do with when consumers feel confident and start to go out and spend money again rather than saving it.
It is the sharp fall in exports to Europe, where our biggest trading partners are themselves facing recession, which makes Britain's hopes of an improvement still slimmer. Exports to the European Community countries were steady in the first part of last year, and after a dip in September, the government hoped the increase signalled an export-led recovery. January's poor showing indicates the economy's problems have not been solved.
And the fact that exports are falling off, particularly to the European Community, I think is worrying. I would guess that's because Germany itself is now slowing down and Europe as a whole is moving into recession. So it'll become more difficult as the year goes on for British companies to sell goods into Europe.
Also of concern is the fall in imports. Analysts say that until interest rates come down, consumers won't spend more and manufacturers won't bring in more raw materials. And ICI's results today, profits down 10% last year, failed to lift the gloom. ICI is Britain's second biggest exporter, but it sees little sign of any recovery yet.
We felt in July and August last year that there were some signs that housing was picking up, demand for consumer goods, but that got snuffed out very sharply in September, October, and by the year end, everything was very flat. And of course, we keep peering anxiously to see a sign of an upturn, but as yet, we can't detect it.
Industry isn't helped either by the uncertainty of the election, and today's figures have only reinforced the reluctance of anyone in the city to predict when the recession will end.
Tax cuts and borrowing were again the battleground for Mr Major and Mr Kinnock in the Commons. The Prime Minister said the Labour Party and Labour leader and his party were terrified of tax cuts which they thought immoral. Mr Kinnock said Mr Major's plans to increase spending, cut taxes and balance the budget didn't add up.
Another Conservative poster, how many more can there be, shows the Tories trying to maintain their earlier success in attacking Labour over tax and spending. John Major, leaving for question time, remains convinced it's Labour's weakest point, but once in the Commons he found Neil Kinnock ready to fight on precisely that battleground. Mr Major, writing in the Huntingdon News 13 years ago, said Mr Kinnock, had called Labour's plans to cut taxes and increase public spending absurd. But that was precisely what Mr. Major was promising now.
Doesn't he recall that he has promised to increase public expenditure, to cut taxes, and to balance the budget? His promises don't add up. He was right.
Well, the Tories thought they'd spotted an own goal there. Mr. Major asked about Labour's plans.
Which would it be, £37 billion of extra taxes or £37 billion of extra expenditure? Which?
A draw perhaps on that one, but another reply from the Prime Minister after an invitation to visit the North East.
I am making plans for a series of visits to all parts of the country and hope to return to the North East.
Well, that only served to confirm to most MPs that polling day will indeed be April the 9th. Reports that May the 7th, still an option, were being openly dismissed as wrong by Tory sources, the result of wobbling by the mostly retiring right-wing old guard of Tory MPs, it was suggested. Labour's campaigning is relentless on education today, against the assisted places scheme, and on the poll tax, up, says Labour, but by less than inflation in England, say the Tories. And on defence, Labour, no immediate spending cuts, the Tories, that's not true. And on defence, the Liberal Democrats suggested today there could be a problem with Labour come a hung Parliament.
We would not be prepared to join a coalition government which did not take the defence of the United Kingdom seriously. I personally believe their approach from a three-boat trident does not provide the secure defence which the country requires.
But the economy is dominating the campaigning. The opposition parties say that the relentlessly bad economic news, today's trade figures just being the latest, shows that the government is economically incompetent. But the Tories say that they've had success in getting inflation and interest rates down, and that they are best placed to lead the country out of recession. And who wins that argument will be crucial. Michael Brunson, News at 10, Westminster.
A man appeared in court in Birmingham today charged with the kidnap and murder of the Leeds teenager Julie Dart. Michael Sams from Sutton-on-Trent in Nottinghamshire was charged earlier this week with kidnapping the Birmingham estate agent Stephanie Slater. He was again remanded in custody.
After 3 days of questioning at Millgarth Police Station in Leeds, the headquarters of the Julie Dart murder inquiry, Michael Sams was transferred back to Birmingham Magistrates Court early this morning. On Monday, Sams appeared in court accused of kidnapping estate agent Stephanie Slater, unlawfully imprisoning her and demanding £175,000 from Shipways Estate Agency with menaces. Last night, Sams was charged with the murder of teenager Julie Dart, whose body was found in Lincolnshire last July. Today he faced 2 other new charges. Michael Sams again limped into court for this second remand hearing. He confirmed his address and date of birth and remained standing as the fresh charges were put to him. He was accused on the 9th of July last year of kidnapping Julie Dart in Leeds. Also, that between the 9th of July and 19th, he murdered Julie Dart in England, Wales or elsewhere. A further charge of demanding £145,000 with menaces from West Yorkshire Police was also put to him. The hearing lasted just 2 minutes, after which Sams was remanded in custody but will not appear in court until March the 26th.
Meanwhile, at Newark in Nottinghamshire, police began digging up the ground behind the tool repair workshop where Michael Sams worked. Sams himself is now in custody in Birmingham's Winton Green Prison. Terry Lloyd, News at 10, Birmingham.
A man was shot and killed by police marksmen in Suffolk today. It happened after he opened fire and wounded a police officer who'd gone to investigate a domestic incident at Bury St Edmunds. The gunman took a driving instructor hostage and fled in his car, but he was stopped and challenged by police, who then opened fire.
The gunman died after police marksmen stopped a car in the village of Fornham All Saints in Suffolk. They'd been pursuing the car for several miles after a gunman hijacked it and took the owner, a driving instructor, hostage. Police say they challenged the man before he was shot dead. His hostage was released uninjured but badly shaken.
There were armed men and there was some shouting going on. And then after that we saw a man being taken into a police car and another one was laying on the floor.
Police were put on alert after an unarmed officer was shot and wounded in the chest and arm. There'd been a domestic incident in a pub 12 miles away in Bury St Edmunds. Police Constable Keith Bottomley had been called to investigate when he was confronted by a man with a sawn-off shotgun.
The policeman was shot and wounded in both the arm and chest. The gunman fled from the scene in a silver Peugeot car, having taken its occupant, a driving instructor, hostage. A description of the vehicle was then broadcast over police radio, and a firearms team was immediately deployed.
Tonight, police sealed off the road in Farnham All Saints while forensic experts examined the scene, and the Police Complaints Authority is to supervise an investigation into the shooting.
MPs here are calling for an apology from the Australian Prime Minister, Mr. Paul Keating, for accusing Britain of deserting his country during the Second World War. His fierce attack in the Australian Parliament came as he replied to criticism that he was disrespectful to the Queen during her recent visit. Here, Mr. Major said he would do his best to try to defuse the situation.
It's the most vitriolic attack ever made by an Australian Prime Minister on Britain. Paul Keating, clearly furious at allegations he'd been discourteous to the Queen, accused his opponents of wanting to return to British bootstrapping and forelock tugging. And then, in an outburst that still strikes a chord with many Australians, he accused Britain of betraying them during the war.
When I was told about I didn't learn respect at school, I tell you I learned one thing. I learned about self-respect and self-regard for Australia. Not about some cultural cringe to a country which decided not to defend the Malaysian Peninsula, not to worry about Singapore, not to give us our troops back to keep ourselves free from Japanese domination.
Despite Japan's ultimate surrender, many Australians believe Churchill had been prepared to sacrifice them for victory against Germany. They resented the refusal of Allied commanders to allow Australian soldiers back home when they feared a Japanese invasion.
The Australians feel quite passionate about the fact that the Australian troops were delayed in returning to Australia. And for that reason, I think that the passion does come through, certainly on the Australian side.
We did what we could to defend Malaya and Singapore. Many good British soldiers fought and died there. I think their families will be very hurt at such untrue and disparaging remarks.
Today's outburst pushed into the background the row over the refusal of the Prime Minister's wife to curtsy to the Queen and his own breach of protocol in placing his arm round the Queen's waist.
This was the country that you people wedded yourself to.
This is most probably what Mr. Keating, facing hostile questioning in his own parliament, was trying to achieve.
The British government is sending equipment and a team of technical advisers to Russia to help it cut its nuclear arsenal. It follows President Boris Yeltsin's appeal for assistance during his visit to London last month. The Defence Secretary Tom King said Britain was making a critical and valuable contribution to protecting the world.
After decades of building a massive nuclear arsenal, Russia now has the job of dismantling it, and it needs help. Russia has control over all the old Soviet Union's nuclear warheads, so it has to withdraw them from sites not only within its own borders, but also from neighbouring republics. There are 27,000 nuclear weapons in the former Soviet Union, most 70% in Russia, but 15% are in the Ukraine and 5% in Belarus. Two-thirds of all these have to be scrapped within 10 years. After a meeting last month between Defence Secretary Tom King and Marshal Shaposhnikov, commander of the armed forces, the government announced today £10 million worth of aid for this year.
Of course, the country is going through the most appalling period of change and transformation. And during this time, they wish to see a great reduction in their nuclear weapons, and we're determined to do what we can to help them with the transport, with the storage, with advice on handling, and that's what we offered them. They've made certain requests to us, and we'll meet those requests in full.
Britain will build 250 containers to house the warheads and 20 armed vehicles to carry the containers to centralised nuclear establishments for dismantling. The weapons-grade plutonium could be used elsewhere, according to British experts.
Once they've stored it, they will then have to address the problem of what is the best thing to do with it to eliminate its possible use in nuclear weapons. And quite clearly there are possibilities that it could be used as a mixed oxide fuel with uranium oxides in a civil nuclear reactor.
Safety at nuclear power stations is likely to be next on the list for British aid. The Energy Secretary John Wakeham will be visiting Russian reactors next week.
The people of Russia are bracing themselves for another savage hike in prices. Soon only the cost of baby food and medicines will be held down. From shopping to school fees, the new Russian revolution's hitting everyone in the pocket. A report coming next in part 2. Plus the new battle in Kuwait, clearing the mines both sides left behind. And in the World Cup, England blow away the Windies. That's in a couple of minutes.
The prices of even more items of food in Russia are set to shoot up at the end of March. Price controls on most things were lifted at the start of the year to produce a more market-led economy. From April onwards, only the cost of baby food and medicines will be held down by state subsidies. January's rises, together with inflation, have put the cost of many basics out of the reach of many Russians, and not just the working classes.
Cosmonaut Alexander Volkov walks in space to carry out vital repairs on the space station Mir. These are some of the most hazardous moments of an 11-month mission that will earn him, in total, the princely sum of £50. Back in mission control, his is in the hands of Russia's top space engineers, men and women on salaries of a little over £1 a week. They've been threatening to go on strike for more pay, even while men are still in orbit, a measure of how desperate life is becoming for Russia's professional middle classes. Mikhail Gudkov is a surgeon at a top Moscow hospital. He too is struggling to live on around £1 a week, way below the official poverty line. These aren't the people who once enjoyed power and privilege under communism, but highly trained professionals who've seen their savings wiped out by hyperinflation.
My pay is 660 rubles a month. I qualified surgeon. I studied for 7 years in institute, and now I have no money for my life.
Professor Vyacheslav Shestakov, one of Russia's top art historians, hated life under communism. During the Brezhnev years, he could only travel abroad if he towed the party line. But now, despite several invitations from universities in Britain, he finds foreign travel is quite out of the question. The Iron Curtain has been replaced, he says, by a dollar curtain.
The dollar's curtain, you cannot go through because you have moral freedom to go anyway, but you have no opportunity to buy tickets.
A visit to the Aeroflot office proves his point. A ticket to London on the state airline costs 58,000 rubles, 6 years' pay on an average salary. So much for freedom to travel. Nowhere do the price rises hurt harder than in the schools, the one area of which the communists were justifiably proud.
This kindergarten used to cost parents 12 rubles a month. When subsidies were removed at the beginning of this year, that shot up to 2,000 rubles a month, way above the average monthly salary here.
Half the children have already left. The remaining parents are getting desperate.
This is impossible. Impossible for everyone.
The commercial director of British Coal resigned today. Mr. Malcolm Edwards was suspended at the end of last year. Last week he warned that 8 out of every 10 pits could close if the government kept to its energy policy. British Airways announced it's not, after all, linking up with the Dutch airline KLM. Midland Bank turned in a surprise rise in pre-tax profits, £36 million last year, 3 times more than the years before. But Royal Insurance lost £373 million last year, worse than the £187 million of the year before that. In the fourth of our series from across Britain on the recession, our industrial correspondent Stephen Cape reports on how it's affecting the Thames Valley, known for its high-tech industries and, until recently, high employment.
In a recession, every job counts. This family building firm has been in business for more than half a century. But this is one of the worst downturns in trade they've ever experienced.
Businessmen, where the most of our turnover has come from in recent years, they're not investing in new factories, new premises or upgrading their offices because at the moment they have not got the funds available or the confidence to do that.
Without funds and confidence, business has been forced to lay off thousands. Here at the Reading Job Centre, out-of-work executives send off batches of application forms using a free service for the unemployed. There are 25 fresh referrals a week. All these people were high-income earners